So there are two government health care programs that are created in 1965, and they are Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare provides health insurance for the elderly and the disabled. It's a social insurance. It's funded entirely by the federal government. And, well, kind of the same critique about the social safety net that is Social Security, that there's the same critique that it's unsustainable in its current form. Okay, I've got a link here to some information about Medicare. I've got a number of videos embedded, and I will link those in the description below, but just to highlight what they look like, this will be about Medicare and Medicaid 101 here. All right. Medicaid provides medical care to the poor. It's a means-tested social welfare policy. So like I previously described, means-tested means that you've got to reach a certain threshold, or in this case, make under a certain amount to be able to access it. It's funded jointly by the federal government, aka the national government, and state governments. And costs have been rising for this program, leading to concerns about the state's ability to continue to pay for this program. Okay. Now, some of these terms, maybe you already knew about them. Maybe you know someone who has access to it. Maybe you yourself have access to one of these programs. So some folks are already in the know. Now, in the last few years, there's been more discussion via political candidates about creating a Medicare for All system within the United States, and I'll show you some clips that I have here coming up. But I'm just noting that the sound of this may be more familiar because it's being more discussed more and more in the news, and particularly on the part of political candidates who are pushing for a healthcare system that actually protects more Americans. And the ideal situation with this is that it would protect all Americans, provide them healthcare. All right, and so I've got an infographic here just to highlight in a visual sense some differences between Medicare and Medicaid and who they cover. So you can see here in terms of age, what's means tested, who pays for it, and how it's paid. So you can consider pausing right here so that you can read this, right? But we highlighted some similar points on the last slide. Let's see what's different here. Yeah, I think some of it just helps, I think, having pictographs to like highlight what it is that we're looking at and thinking about as well. So consider checking that out more deeply. And I have some links here, so examples for change, and I was really considering here thinking really specifically about healthcare. And so one clip that I have here highlights healthcare in Canada. I think unless you are from another country or have been to another country or know people who live in another country, you might just perceive the American healthcare system as like the norm. And you might not know that there are examples of other, nations that provide health insurance for the whole country, like Canada. Okay, so here's the video I will link to. How does healthcare work in Canada? Because I think it's good for us to have that comparative experience, or comparative experience, just having seen, or at least be able to know that like there are comparable examples of nations that have provide healthcare to all of their citizens. Okay, as I was just discussing about Medicare for All, who was that? It was Bernie Sanders. And here's a clip from Bernie Sanders' YouTube page on Medicare for All now, and what that means, and particularly from a political perspective. What does it mean that Bernie pushed for Medicare for All, and that it became part of the popular discussion about what needs to happen around healthcare and access to healthcare for all people within the country? So with each presidential run that Bernie Sanders has made, I think this idea has become more and more well known, and I wanted to provide it to you directly right here. Okay, and some additional info I wanted to share would be, I'll link these clips about Medicare for All Explained, just to provide us some more information here. I'm not going to link those. I will link those in the box below. All right, moving on to another idea, another concept here is fiscal versus monetary policy. Okay. Fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is government where the government regulates the economy through the powers to tax and spend. And the president and Congress play a major role in fiscal policy. Okay. Right, so what's taxed and how are they going to spend money, right? Everything costs, right? So anything that you want to do, whether it's, I don't know, I'm thinking of stimulus checks being sent out during COVID, right? Like these things, they cost money, right? And so that's okay. Life costs money, but it depends how you budget. So fiscal policy is how the government is deciding to use their budget. Right? How much do they want to give to, like, the Pentagon, for example? How much, right, is there a difference in the budget between this year and last year, right? That's a representation of the fiscal policy, okay? Monetary policy is where the government regulates the economy by manipulating interest rates. So you've probably heard, or you may have heard discussions about rising interest rates in this moment and fluctuating interest rates in these past years. Interest rates were lower during the earlier part of COVID, and that they've gone up to try to respond to inflation, for example, right? So this is different than fiscal policy, right? So that discussion of when the government and specifically the Federal Reserve plays a major role here in whether or not they raise rates or lower rates. And then we see the effect on the economy, but more than the economy, you see the effect on the country as a result of the interest rates. So, for example, I've got some clips here, but like if interest rates have to do with borrowing money, right? And how much you're going to have to pay when you pay the money back, right? So when interest rates are low, that means you're going to have to pay back less money, right? And it's a good time to do things like buy a house, right? And when interest rates are higher, well, it's going to be more expensive to do that same thing, right? So that's this kind of discussion, the real world effect on folks when interest rates change. And I've got a link here as well that I will share in the description box below. All right, let's think now about tax policy. Yes, tax policy. Well, here are a few examples, and some of which you may be familiar with from having heard over the course of your life, or maybe not. But one is supply side economics. Now, you may have heard of Reaganomics, where a lot of these ideas, we still associate it today with Reagan. But it's this idea that if you cut taxes, that's especially taxes for like businesses, taxes for the wealthy, that somehow, even though you've cut taxes, right, people are going to have to pay less, that somehow it's ultimately going to generate more, not less government revenue. So I've actually included a link here about supply side economics. I will include in the link below. And there's progressive taxes, so like income tax. These are taxes whose rates increase with income. We might compare progressive taxes with regressive taxes. And that's a tax that requires poor people to pay a higher proportion of their income compared with well-off. That's like, think about people who are buying, cigarettes or alcohol, right? There's a certain tax on those things. Right? And when you buy them, the tax is the same for everybody. But if you make more income, a higher income, it's going to be that tax is going to be a smaller percentage of your income than if you make a smaller income, right? A low income. So that regressive tax, highlighting that it can cause poor people to pay a higher proportion of their income, right? They're more likely to feel it more with that regressive tax than a higher income person. So all of this, right? How people pay taxes. What kind of taxes do we pay? Who supports paying what kinds of taxes? I mean, all of this is rooted and well, someone's making decisions, or someone's, and rooted in tax policy. There's often discussion about reforming or changing the tax code, right? And some proposed reforms to the tax code are a flat tax, right? And this is a tax system in which all people pay the same percentage of their income to taxes, right? So everybody pays, 3%, okay? Or a consumption tax. This is a plan in which people are taxed not only on what they earn, but on what they spend. Right? So, I think we become more familiar with taxes, at least a little bit, when we are working a job, let's say a job that pays you with like a check, so you can see what taxes have been taken out. For example, how much goes to state taxes, how much goes to federal taxes, right? We get a sense directly how taxes affect us, right? And maybe not of course, but hey, each year we have to pay income taxes, right? You submit each year and see what you owe through a somewhat convoluted process that could be easier, but you do the rigmarole to figure out what you owe, and then you pay those taxes. So thinking through the policy, when you're thinking about taxes, this affects everything in a country, right? How you raise money to do the things that have to happen in a country, right? Whether it be defense, right? Military, whether it be roads and infrastructure, right? These things are all rooted in collecting money and having a budget to be able to actually complete those projects. All right, I want to get to rounding out this discussion on domestic policy to consider some of these issues that I have brought up over the course of the semester, like watching the expansion of workers unionizing across the U.S., particularly in this political moment, and also just understanding in general about taxes in this country and how they affect people differently. So I've included a link here about how the wealthy paying taxes. Let's see if I can show you that. Yes, it's called How the Rich Avoid Paying Taxes. This is what it looks like, and I will link to this video. All right, and then I've included, I guess my last slide here for this lecture is going to be highlighting protests for domestic policy. So I have highlighted, so remember, domestic policy is like legislation, right? It's where everything around us has to do with policy. So I've got a link here highlighting when the Supreme Court decision about Roe versus Wade was leaked back, I think, in May. And so here it highlights a protest. If I can show it to you. Don't have to start that, but about protest after that leaked opinion. Okay, let's go to this opinion. All right, and I also wanted to show you rallies here. This is, let's see if I can find the title here. Climate Change Rally in downtown LA. This is where climate scientists lock themselves, I think, to the front of a bank here to bring attention to the crisis, right? These are people who are, what are they protesting for? Well, they're protesting particularly for domestic policy change, right? On the issue of climate change. In this example, of course, climate change is a global issue, but trying to get a reaction, a domestic one, right? It's not just about countries pointing the finger at each other, but actually needing to do something, like yesterday. So I will link this as well. And I wanted to include this link. It's a part of a speech here from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This is a speech on civil disobedience and obeying just versus unjust laws. I think in the vein of thinking about people protesting for domestic policy or policy change, to think about those folks who organize around policy and policy change, and also recognition. Remember, laws are not moral, right? Laws are a reflection of what's happening in the society at that time, right? So I think this is worth checking out if you have the time to. Of course, I will link this below. Okay, I think this is all interesting food for thought as we think about domestic policy, right? And be able to connect it to these ideas like this one around civil disobedience and just versus unjust laws. I mean, remember, as an example, remember that slavery within the U.S. was legal, right? Right, so that these laws don't match up with a kind of thought around morality, right? Laws are a reflection of like the politics and socialness of the time, and of course political power. Anyhow, that's food for thought on this issue of domestic policy.